Hello.
Hello.
This is our 20th Fireside Chat, and thank you for coming. You're all regular faces, so I'll make it very quick. Sharon will introduce you to Bob. You all know Bob. I have to remind you to spend money on our new cards. We've reissued the cards with pictures of the shul on, and to watch the website for further events. The other thing I have to remind you to do is please now take a look at your mobile phone. Make sure that it's switched either to flight mode or off. Can't say just turn it off anymore. But there you are. Please do. Mine is not, so I'll do mine now. But thanks very much for coming, and Sharon, take it away.
Thank you very much indeed. And Bob, thank you very much for joining us on this 20th talk of the Fireside Chat series. And thank you so much for bringing in so many gorgeous photographs. We'll be going through those in some detail. You're a very familiar face in Hong Kong. You've lived here some 30 years. There are few people, and tonight's attendance is a real tribute to how many people do know you and know all of the things you've done. You were born in the USA in 1949. Were both of your parents also born in the US?
No, my mom is from London, an English girl. I grew up listening to English songs such as London's Pride has been handed down to us. And my dad was from South Orange, New Jersey. On both sides of my family, they were very Western. Both my father's parents and my mother's parents were born in the States, in the case of my father, and in England, in the case of my mom. This is my dad in 1944 and my mom in 1946.
Had they met in the US?
Yeah, my dad and mom met at the Australian Servicemen's Club, where my dad saw her, fell in love, and offered to light her cigarette.
In London or Australia?
In London, no, in London, Australian Servicemen's Club in London, right after the war in 1946. And they fell in love, and they were married in November 29th, 1948, which, if I'm not mistaken, is an important date in Jewish history, the UN recommendation of the partition of Palestine.
And they were married in England or in the US?
At United Synagogue in London.
You were born a couple of years later, and were you named after anyone in particular?
Yeah, I grew up being known as Bobby, and I was named after Bobby Diamond. Bobby Diamond was my dad's cousin, who was killed in World War II. He was in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and his plane went down in England. It was a plane crash. So that was the only family member lost in the war, and I'm named after him.
Your mum made the move from London over to the US in order to live with your father, and you were born and you had two brothers who followed on, Joey in 53 and David in 55.
Right.
And 1955 turned out to be a difficult year for you health-wise. What was it that you confronted?
Yeah, well, you're all looking at a kind of a dinosaur, because I was the last case of polio in Essex County, New Jersey. I had measles and went back to school and came down with a super high temperature, and my mother called the doctor, and he examined me, and he said to her, he either has polio or spinal meningitis. Pray for polio. And I was taken to Orange Memorial Hospital. I remember this all really vividly. I got gypped because I was taken in a blue ambulance. And we all know that ambulances are supposed to be white with their red lights running. I was 5. I was quarantined there. I was told, my parents were told anything he brings in must stay in. I couldn't see my parents. My mother was pregnant with my little brother, my littlest brother. She was about 8 months pregnant at that point. And my dad could only come to a window outside my room. I refused to eat, so they tied my hands to the crib side and put in an IV with me screaming bloody murder. And they kept an autoclave in the room, which, as far as I was concerned, was some kind of torture implement. I had to have hot baths several times a day, which also continued. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks and then home for 3 months, not allowed to see any other children, just family members. Lucky for me, there are 3 types of polio. There's fatal, paralytic, and non-paralytic, and I obviously had non-paralytic. But it was a terrifying experience, and a couple weeks before, my father's sister had taken me to see Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus in Madison Square Garden. And there was a little boy in this funny chair with wheels, and I said to my Aunt Jane, well, why is that boy in a chair with wheels? And she said, oh, well, he can't walk. I said, well, why can't he walk? She said, well, he had polio. And a couple weeks later, I had polio.
It must have had quite a profound impact on you, sort of not just as a young boy, but ongoing. I mean, this would have absolutely traumatized you and the family.
It did. In kindergarten, I was frisky, shall we say. Bobby Wiggins and I were probably the least well-behaved 2 boys in the class. We didn't like listening to our teacher. I had polio in May of my kindergarten year. And when I went back for 1st grade, I was very sort of fearful, very quiet, very shy. My 1st grade teacher knew that and encouraged me to come out. And over time, I changed. I'm still extremely shy, as you know.
At 7 years of age, you're known here in Hong Kong as very much a Jewish teacher and philosopher. We'll hear more about that later. But at 7 years of age, you had the first of your spiritual and intellectual challenges with God.
Yes.
Perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit
Well,
about that.
there are 2 stories here. I'll make them brief. We moved within our town, and I needed to start at the new school that I was going to. So for a period of about a month and a half, my grandmother would pick me up and take me home because we had not yet moved to the house that we occupied for about 53 years. And I needed a ride, otherwise I could walk to school. So she dropped me off, and as she was pulling up, I happened to ask her, Mommy Jeanette, where do babies come from? And my grandmother, this grandmother, was a rather sort of proper, self-styled, MAME, M-A-M-E, that is Louisville, Grand Dame. And she said, well, babies come from God. So I said to her, well, how does that work? So she said, well, a man and a woman get married. Some of you may not know this. And they pray for a baby, and then God sends the baby. So I said, okay. So I remember getting out of the car, closing the door, walking up to the house and thinking, that's proof there's a God. The second story was there was a television program called Claude Kirshner's Terry-Toon Circus. And at the end of it, he would say, and now, boys and girls, it's time for most of you to go to bed at 7:30, which it was. And it was sponsored by Coco Marsh chocolate syrup. And Coco Marsh sponsored a kind of a raffle or a draw that if you bought Coco Marsh, steamed off the label and sent it in, you could win a Ford Thunderbird Jr. This was a car that would drive on the sidewalk. It was all electrical. It had lights and horn and radio and everything. So I lusted after this car, and I forced my mother to buy a whole bunch of Coco Marsh bottles, which lasted years. Sent in all the different entries, but more importantly, I prayed. I prayed very, very hard that I was going to win. There was no one more intentional than I in praying. And I knew that by the time the drawing took place on TV, I was the sure winner. So Claude Kirshner pulled the label out, or whatever it was, and some nerd from Staten Island won. Needless to say, I had my faith shattered. So I was told it to my parents. I said, look, you don't pray for a Ford Thunderbird Jr., so believe me, I never have.
So you learnt better, and you learnt better from a Miss Carter, who you feel pretty indebted to?
Yes, I was kind of always a bit advanced in school. In first grade, my Uncle Bert, who was a great influence on me, and after my son Ben is named, gave me all 3 of the Dick, Jane, and Sally Learn to Read books. And so I read them all, and I was proceeded to be very bored in first grade where you had to learn to read. Miss Carter was of this class she was a waspy spinster lady who lived across the street from my grandparents in South Orange, New Jersey. They were bachelors, she was a spinster, but she was such a brain, and she knew how to draw out of me some performance. I used to finish work early, and I was reading this monstrous book on Robin Hood, and for some reason, I think the regular rule was that you couldn't read it, but she allowed me to read it, and she became a lifelong friend. So much so, when we started the First Pacific Group, which was backed by Indonesia's Salim Group in the early 80s, I called on her, and I said, I told her what I was doing, no longer practicing law, and I said, our backers are the Salim Group. And she said to me, oh, isn't that Lim Shulong's group? This is a retired teacher in South Orange, New Jersey. So I said, yes, how did you know that? She said, I don't know. She read the New York Times, that's how she knew.
So we have a lot to thank Miss Carter for. Your mother being English, did you as a family ever return to England for holidays, or was your life very much America-centric?
Yeah, there were 2 trips we took to England in my boyhood. One, I was about 18 months old, and we went over, we used to go by a steamship, by ocean liner. And the first one was in 1950, or 51, I'm not sure, and 51. And what was important to me is that my mom's dad died in 1953. And when I was about 10 years old, I said to her, did Papa ever sort of hold me and bounce me on his knee while he was watching a circular black and white television? And she said, you used to love that. So I actually have a memory of her dad. In 1960, my mom took myself and my 2 younger brothers to England for the summer. And then she took me to Paris for 5 days. And of course, I actually have more family in the UK than I do in the US, because her family is larger than my dad's family. And I became very Englishified in that I became a soccer aficionado and was one of the few American kids at that time who actually knew how to play it, and was very impressed by her sort of taking down a French shopkeeper who was trying to jig me when I was buying a bronze Tour Eiffel in Paris, and she was my motivation to actually study French with on Saturday mornings with a teacher, Miss Sonia Lee.
I hope you learned to call it football when you were in England and not soccer.
Probably.
September 1961 was a real tragedy in the life of your family with the accident that occurred to your father. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, it was actually October, but my father worked at his father's company called the Anti-Hydro Waterproofing Company in Badger Avenue in Newark, New Jersey, and they used to have a sales meeting once a month. And he was sent up to get some papers that were in the so-called annex, which was another factory building that had a floor and then the roof. Through the roof was a skylight, and through the floor below it was a skylight. There was a pipe running a few inches along the floor, which the city of Newark had condemned as unsafe. And my father must have, didn't know what it did, must have tripped, but he tripped and fell head first through the skylight on 18 feet below onto a cement floor. He smashed his vertebrae at the fifth vertebrae and nearly died, of course, and spent the rest of his life as a quadriplegic. He was paralyzed from here on down, so he could move his arms, but his hands had been damaged from the fall, and you needed both hands to grip a pen to write. He was in the hospital for how many months, and then transferred to the Kessler Institute of Rehabilitation in West Orange, New Jersey, which is world famous, and we had to have the entire house remodeled. We had to punch through a door to the outside and put in a hydraulic lift so he could wheel his wheelchair into the living room, dining room area. The porch and the pantry were all knocked down and turned into a large downstairs bedroom and bath that would take a wheelchair. And so that I was not quite 12 when that happened.
Your father passed away 18 years later in 1979, but during those 18 years when he is a quadriplegic, was he able to work, or was he very much homebound? And
He worked. My dad was a trooper. He never gave up. He had a whole routine in the morning. We had an orderly, a male orderly, who would come in 7 days a week, and him or his substitute. My dad, when you're paralyzed, you have all sorts of problems, bed sores and lack of circulation. He had to stand at some parallel bars just so the blood would go down into his legs. By 12:30, he would leave with his lunch. There was a taxi that would pick him up, and the guy would help him slide on a sliding board, and he'd go down to Newark, which is 20 minutes away, and he'd come back by about 6 o'clock at night. So he did work.
this was the year before your bar mitzvah. Did it delay the bar mitzvah? Did you have a bar mitzvah?
Yeah, I was bar mitzvah. Our family had been members of Temple B'nai Jeshurun, which used to be on High Street in Newark. I was probably at my stage the 4th generation Myers. My forebears on the Myers came to the United States in 1867 from Germany, probably the Mannheim region. It's a beautiful synagogue, and yes, I was bar mitzvah nevertheless, and my portion was Lech Lecha, get thee out, so, which is why I'm here. I took it very literally.
Get thee out seems to have been a sort of feature in your life, and you were certainly getting out in the summer of 1965 when you were about 15 or 16 years of age and embarked upon an epic journey across the US.
Yeah, I was interested in doing what this US people call kind of a teen tour. The American Youth Hostels had train and bicycle tours. The preceding summer I had spent 5 weeks going across Canada to Alberta and back by train and cycling major pieces of it. The following year was a 7-week trip across the United States by train and back, and all the way to California, where I got no fewer than 2 tickets, one for riding my bike on the freeway and the other for jaywalking on a Sunday morning when there wasn't any car about in Los Angeles. So.
And on that journey, you met somebody who described themselves in terms of being a completed Jew.
Yeah, this was a very formative experience. By the way, in California, one day we decided to combine the cycling of 2 days. We did 126 miles from San Francisco to Monterey in one day. And when I finished it about 10 o'clock at night, I thought to myself, this is probably the peak physical experience that I'm going to do in my life. And I was right. It's been downhill ever since. The trip ended up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Dutch country, in a youth hostel. And we were there. We had another day or 2 to go. And there was a couple there, probably in their late 20s. He was a minister, a Christian minister. And she described she was his wife, and she described herself as a completed Jew. So I hadn't come across this term in Hebrew school, and I asked her what was a completed Jew. And she said, well, I'm Jewish, and we do Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and everything, but I have accepted Jesus into my heart. So we got into a classic battle about whether Jesus really was foretold in the Bible, and whether it was a virgin that conceived or just a maiden and so forth. And I had a big disadvantage. I knew nothing. A couple other Jewish kids and I were kind of, having this discussion, stroke argument with them, but we didn't know what we were talking about. And I felt humiliated. And when I got home, I told my parents about this, and I said, this is never going to happen to me again. I said, I'm going to read the Bible, the Jewish Bible, from cover to cover in English, and so I'm never going to be caught, unawares. So I started doing that. I had questions, and I would ask the rabbi, and he would say, well, but in the Hebrew it's this, and so forth. So I began to take an Ulpan class at another synagogue at night, and this just kind of snowballed. I read Max Diamond's Jews, God, and History, and Exodus, and my heart was, you could hear it there. Thank God it's still working. It became the theme of my last year or two of high school. I became a kind of a born-again Jew. I got very much back into it.
Certainly a very enlightened one, and something that's followed you ever since. I mean, you haven't stopped learning. In the summer of 1967, you were handing in your senior history paper in order to graduate from high school. What was particularly significant about that?
I graduated in June of '67, and those of you who are old enough to remember can remember that Israel was under siege. It was mobilized for 3 weeks, and literally on about 3 a.m. on the morning of Monday, June 5th, 1967, Bob is typing away my history paper, which was on President Truman's recognition of the State of Israel, giving it de facto recognition in 1948, and the particular role played by his former business partner, Eddie Jacobson. And I went to sleep for about 3 hours. At 7 a.m., my mother wakes me up and says, "Bobby, there's war in Israel." And so I handed it in thinking, boy, is this ever irrelevant. But I had signed up for a university course organized out of the States, but mostly to be held at the Hebrew University, to go to Israel that summer. Of course, we all held our breath as the Six-Day War unfolded, and when it was over, it was just a miracle. You could feel it. But then the U.S. State Department blocked all travel to the affected countries, including Israel. So the Jewish establishment got on and took all these summer trips on. So ultimately, they unblocked it. And sometime in the June 20 something or another, I found myself landing in Lud Airport, as it was then called, and being housed at some youth village in Ramat Gan, and going to the theater that night with a bunch of other teenagers, and the newsreels. They had just shown the first newsreels, which we've all seen now, of the Israeli jets through the sights shooting down airplanes and the bombing runs and so forth. The place was in a euphoria for the entire, summer and then beyond. And an ironic story, if I can tell it, when the trip was on, my mother got a little worried, and she went to our Rabbi Eli Pilchik, and she said, "Rabbi, do you think it'll be safe for Bobby to go to Israel this summer?" And he said to her, "Jean, it'll be safer in Israel this summer than it will be here." Why he said that, I don't know. But what I do know is that in July, all of a sudden we opened the International Herald Tribune, and the Newark ghetto just blew up, and the National Guard was called in. Something like 23 people were shot. There was a martial law imposed there, and a curfew and the whole thing. My father couldn't go to work. And lo and behold, I think Rabbi Pilchik was probably plugged into on high, but it was absolutely correct. Whereas in Israel, certainly that summer, the Arabs were so demoralized, it was completely peaceful. All you heard in Jerusalem was the blowing up of mines, mokshim, clearing of them.
You spent just over 2 months or so in Israel that summer, and really just 2 weeks after the end of the war. Were you able to travel around Israel very much, or were you very much home-based?
Well, as part of the program, we traveled the country from Eilat to the north. But I had made friends with a guy my age, who was 17, named Israel Eisenberg. And one day, he contacted me and said, his father said, "Well, let's go down to Gaza in El Arish." So I said, okay. So we piled into this kind of rickety car they had, and we drove through the Gaza Strip, through Gaza, Khan Yunis, finally to El Arish, which is outside of Gaza. It's in Egypt proper. And that was the headquarters for the Egyptian army. And when I was there, this was some weeks after the war, and I don't know why this was possible, but we went into the headquarters, and there must have been some kind of map room. There were just dozens and dozens of maps lying all over. So the dad says, "Well, take one if you'd like." So I said, "Can I have more than one?" He said, "You can take whatever you want." I did. I took about 10 or 12, and one of them, which is on the wall there, that's a photocopy on the wall. They were all in Arabic. They showed Israel and the battlefields and Mitla Pass and Sharm el-Sheikh and so forth. That one struck me as particularly interesting. Why? It's in English. It was drawn and compiled by the Royal Engineers of the British Army. Date, May 1943. Well, what was a map like that doing in Egyptian Army headquarters in 1967 when, if you look at the map, you can't even see a lot because there was no Eilat in 1943. There was a little muddy Arab village called Rashrash. So I've brought them back. I still have them. They're actually with me in Hong Kong, and I've talked to Ricky Shemesh about perhaps donating them to the new Israel Army Museum in Tel Aviv.
And there are pictures here, ladies and gentlemen, and when we end, you're very welcome to look. You can see pictures there of Bob's 1967 trip. And here also, ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome to look through Bob's family album. But what is very interesting about the pictures on the wall, as you'll see, there's a picture of David Ben-Gurion just feet away from you. Can you tell us
about? I was invited to some World Union of Jewish Students, and David Ben-Gurion, who then was retired as Prime Minister, spoke, and so I took a picture of him. I also a picture of Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was the Israel Army chief rabbi. You'll also see up there some very interesting cartoons drawn on the wall. Which one is that? Anyway, I guess the middle one of these three black ones. We were the first student group to go back to the old Mount Scopus Har HaTzofim campus of the Hebrew University. When the armistice was agreed to in 1948, Israeli soldiers occupied the Hebrew University campus on Har HaTzofim. And so the deal that was agreed was that they remained there for 17 days, and every 17 days under UN auspices, they were relieved by another unit. And this went on from 1948 for 19 years until 1967. Well, some cartoon genius was so bored, he began to draw funny cartoons on the wall of the classroom, making fun, that is, of Israel Army life. And you'll take a look. Some of them are a little obscene, but they're very funny. So I took pictures of them. Of course, today they've renovated the old campus, added lots of new buildings and so forth. But I need to find my negatives for that and tell them about it too.
You returned to the US in the fall of 1967, an 18-year-old young man starting at Columbia College, fueled with enthusiasm, undoubtedly, for Israel after this great trip. And you became the founder member of a group that became even more famous in Israel about 30 years later.
No connection. There was no Hillel in Hong Kong for reasons that I couldn't remember. There was a rabbi there, but there was no formal Jewish student organization. So I was a co-founder with a fellow named Stephen Cohen. Stephen Cohen then had one ambition in life, that was to become the foremost sociologist of the Jewish people in the United States and around the world. And that's exactly what he is to this day. So he was he's still around, he's a very active, forceful guy. And we started up Kadima, which just means forward, and we had 125 students, including some Columbia professors, taking Hebrew and Ulpanim. We had Israeli dancing, we had Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat services, we had teach-ins, we had protests against the Soviet Union about their treatment of Soviet Jews. We actually invented a protest where you show up in sort of concentration camp stripes, and we had this little very light coffin, and we paraded it around in front of the Soviet mission to the United Nations on the east side of New York. And quite a few people went on from there to become active in the Jewish world, including Leon Wieseltier, who is the editor of the New Republic, a couple professors, Marcia Rosenblit and Ellen Birnbaum. Dennis Prager also was involved. So it spawned a whole host of Jewish activists and teachers.
And anybody who is old enough to have lived through the 60s would have remembered that 1968 was this incredible year of turbulence worldwide. There always seemed to be something going on. And particularly for you Americans, for young men, there was the worry of being called up to serve in the Vietnamese War. Was this something that was ever a realistic problem for you or prospect?
Well, two responses. On April 23rd, 1968, Columbia students led by Mark Rudd of my hometown of Maplewood, New Jersey, the son of a U.S. Army colonel and Jewish, seized the campus and closed it down for, I forget, something like 10 days or 14 days, until the president and the trustees called in the New York City police to clear the campus, which meant cracking a lot of heads. I was not one of those protesters since I was just a wet behind the ears freshman, but I do have some pictures, I think that may be up there. And of course, we all had the draft hanging over our heads. And I think it was on December 1st of 1969, there was to be held a draft lottery. This was like decide your fate. They had two bowls. They had 366 balls in one bowl, each one with one of the dates of the year. And in the second one, they had 366 balls, each numbered from 1 to 366. And they would pull them out. And whatever your birthday number was, that would be the order of priority that you were called to the draft, starting with number 1. So the lower the number, the worse it was. That evening, I was given tickets, because I couldn't afford them, to some giant Israel Bonds rally in Madison Square Garden. And my prayers must have gone straight to heaven as a result of that. When I got back to the dorm, I'd asked my roommate, said, check my birthday and tell me what happened. He said, oh, you're okay, you're 266. And remind you, I still had a year and a half of student deferment, and what proved to be the case was right after that, they never really got higher than about 125. So all of a sudden, no draft for Bob, whereas other people still had to worry about it and take steps in some cases.
You graduated in 1971, and did you know where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do as the next step?
Well, I was torn. I had applied to Oxford and had been accepted to do Arabic and Islamic studies because I felt that to be effective in the Middle East, you needed to know some Arabic, and that became a further theme later on. But I also had applied to law school. Columbia Law School accepted me. It was very hard to get in. There were a lot of disappointed applicants from the college because we had a lot of returning Vietnam vets coming to the law school, and they had trouble gauging the ingress of these applicants. Part of me wanted to go to Oxford, both because of not wanting to grow up. My mother, I thought, would get a giant thrill out of it. I did want to learn Arabic. And part of me also just wanted to get going with life and get into some profession. And my grandfather, meanwhile, twisted my arm off to go to Columbia. And I would tell people, I haven't decided yet. I think I'm going to Oxford. And I get this funny feeling in my stomach. And I'd say, the next person, well, I'm thinking more to Columbia. And I think, that's probably right to do. So I accepted Columbia in spite of the pressure from my grandfather to go there. And because I really decided I needed to get on with life, and I didn't want another 3 years of undergraduate studies.
And life at Columbia was fun, intense, or easy, or?
I'm fond of saying two things about my class. My classmates were all geniuses. They were all absolutely determined to do well. These were not young. I was 23, 24. A lot of them had other careers. They'd been waylaid in the Army. They wanted to get on with it. And secondly, the professor at Columbia has very high standards, and the professors, for example, the contracts professor, he wouldn't teach you black letter contract law. He would figure you just learn that by reading the cases. He wanted to talk about the interstices of different contract doctrines, and that's what he would challenge you on in class. It was very hard. My first semester, I didn't really take it seriously, so I had some nice C's. And I'm not used to having C's, so I had to make it a real personal decision. Do I get with the program and really study, or just drop out? Well, dropping out is not my style either. So I did, and I spent the next 2.5 years living in the library, basically.
And did you find that there was a lot of student pressure? Did you come across instances of students just not being able to cope?
Most kids who start law school and feel it's not right for them know it in the first week. So I actually was intellectually interested in it. I was never one of these guys who hated law school, hated the bar, and hated law practice. particularly in the United States, which is a society started with legal agreements. The Mayflower Compact, the first thing the colonists did when they landed at Plymouth in Massachusetts was sign an agreement about how it was all going to work. And I remember saying after the first year of law school, everyone should have to take 1L, first year of law school. Because when you read the papers, all of a sudden they came alive with all sorts of legal disputes going on, and I could understand a lot more just as a general proposition. But it was hard work.
You and your friend Anna had a grisly experience?
Yeah, I didn't really get to know my law school classmates that well because I spent 2 of my 3 years, I was in the dorms of Columbia College as a residence hall counselor, and then in my senior year as the head resident hall counselor of Fernald Hall, which is 360 students. I had, I guess, 9 or 10 counselors on my staff. One of them, Anna Quinlan, who's a famous author, used to write for the New York Times, has written many books, and some have been filmed. She was on the counselor on the 5th floor. And I got a knock on my door at night in the early evening, and she was there, and she said, "There's something wrong, you have to come down." So we went down, and we went to the door of one of the solo rooms on the floor, and had a funny smell. Opened the door, and there was a young female student who had killed herself by drinking, I suppose, sleeping pills. She was in her chair by her desk with her head back up, and had already that sweet smell of death, if any of you have ever experienced it, was already about. So we discovered her, that became big news. Nobody did anything wrong. I mean, everyone went over this a million times, but she was someone, she had problems. Her parents had her seeing a psychiatrist in Westchester, also in New York City, and everything that could have been done for her was being done for her. She just stole a few moments to kill herself, and I remember the housekeeper saw her stumbling in and out of the bathroom, but she just said, "I had too much to drink."
Fortunately, you were able to cope with the academic pressures, and a year before you graduated in 1974, you were offered a clerkship with a judge.
Yes. In my never-ending quest to put off real life, a friend of mine, Tom Armistead, had clerked for a federal district judge and loved it. For those of you who don't know, this is something you only do really out of law school. You don't handle the administrative stuff. You write draft opinions and give memos and so forth. So I thought that would be a lot of fun. Put off my growing up another couple of years. I applied all around the country, was willing to look in odd places, including Atlanta, Georgia. I went down with the law firm, flew me down, and I wrote all the judges that I wanted to see them. And Judge Charles A. Moy Jr. Said he would see me, and a couple others did. And I had to postpone my flight twice in the afternoon because he was on the bench till 6 p.m. 6 p.m. he comes out, we have a 22-minute interview. And I'm thinking, I really liked him. I mean, it was a chemistry, but this was so short. But this is a guy who made up his mind quickly, and he called me up in December and said, "Oh, but you want to come down to Atlanta?" So I said, "Sir, I have 24 hours to think it over, but I think my answer is going to be yes." So I did.
Well done. Now, October 74, you graduated, and you have a life-changing moment.
We're at October 7th.
October 1974. Your eyes glance
Right.
at a gorgeous blonde, and destiny starts to unfold.
Yeah, that's my first wife, Debbie, who I felt was really Cupid's arrow, love at first sight. I want to say I did, instead of going to Oxford, I spent a couple weeks going to Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan in 74, and then trying virtually in vain to find an Arabic language teacher in Atlanta. I did find a class. The St. Elias Eastern Orthodox Church had a Lebanese Arabic class going on Wednesday evenings from 7:30 to 8:30 in the basement. So I said, "Well, I'm Jewish, but would it be okay for me to come?" And they said, "You're most welcome." So I go there, go down to the basement, and then I saw her, except her hair was down to her tuchus, and as I said, Cupid's arrow found its mark. And she put me off for quite a few months, notwithstanding my attempts to try to get closer to her. but ultimately we did get together.
You did get together. You became engaged in 78, but before that you'd gone on an overseas trip together in 76.
Yes, this is also part of the, I had wanted to spend a year between college and law school. And when I got into Columbia, I said, can you defer my admission? And they said, no, sorry, while we will look favorably on a prior admission, we won't guarantee it. So I thought, all right, don't be an idiot, I gotta go. So this year around the world trip that I had fantasized about just evaporated. So instead, however, when I finished clerking, there was a trip called the Road to Kathmandu by bus, run by this real character of a lady, Jan Biddle, of the famous Mayflower Biddle family from, she was in New York. I'm not sure whether she was from Philadelphia at some point, but she, for $330, your transportation was taken care of from Istanbul across Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, to Kathmandu, Nepal. You have to pay for your own lodging, which was about $2 in most of the hotels along the way. So I signed up and I thought, all right, I'll go see this part of the world, which I'm glad I did because you can't go there anymore. It's not, I mean, parts of it's just not safe. And I went back into India and then flew through most of the countries in East Asia because I had accepted a position at Kudair Brothers, and they had just opened up in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. So I stopped at their offices as well.
And so that really sort of drew your interest and excitement about living here in the Far East.
Yeah, I saw the 1976 version of Asia that we have now, and my eyes were opened. To show you what a smart guy I am, when I was at Columbia, they had, I distinctly remember, they had a 4-point Oriental Civilization and Humanities course, China, Japan, India, Thailand, and I remember thinking, I'm very sort of broad in my interests. I thought, I really should take that, but it was 4 points, it was going to be hard to squeeze it in, and I remember telling myself, you'll never have anything to do with that part of the world. So I never did.
Well, luckily you did. Now, in 1978, you spent the summer in Hong Kong working at the Kudair office. And on your return from Hong Kong, Debbie met you with some really very dreadful news about your brother.
Yeah, Debbie and I got engaged before I left in July. I was here July, August, and September, back on a flight that took a lot longer than today, but was landing on September 29th. And Debbie met me at the airport and said, there's something wrong with your brother. Your mother has rushed down to Arlington, Virginia. My brother David also went to Columbia, had straight A's, went to Georgetown School of Law, and was an honor student, and given sort of not teaching, but guidance responsibilities. And he had, it was a Friday night, and he had, quote, the worst headache of his life, had gone upstairs with his roommates, and then promptly collapsed on the bed. Everything went perfectly in terms of help for him. They called the police and the ambulance. The ambulance came almost immediately because they were very close to Arlington Memorial Hospital. As he was being pulled out, a doctor happened to walk by, I said, I'll go with him, took him to the hospital. He was attended to by Dr. Tochek, who was then a world-famous brain specialist, but he was in a coma. And we tried to go to sleep, 2 hours, 3 hours, I couldn't stand it, so we jumped in the car and drove down to Arlington, went straight to the hospital, and he was a big guy, my brother David, and he was lying on the bed, decerebrating, if you know what that is. He basically had these terrible shakings. He looked like a Frankenstein monster, but he wasn't on a ventilator. He could breathe by himself, and we hoped he would come out of it. Debbie and I were to be married on exactly a month later, on October 29th, and as a result, David, in effect, he was alive. He lasted 5 years, but it was as if he had died. So the whole wedding was just collapsed to immediate family and very close friends.
The wedding went ahead in October 78, and you were married? Where?
At Temple of B'nai Jeshurun. This was actually outside, and we were
So the
blessed.
family tradition continuing at that same synagogue?
Yeah, it was outside under a chuppah, and it was very nice. And I have a wedding album, which is different. That was such a great picture there that the photographer blew it up to poster size and displayed it in his front window. My mother asked him if she could have it, and he said, well, it'll be there for 9 months and you can have it. But it was outside, it was green, and it was, the pictures, only one picture shows the heartbreak that everyone felt because of David.
You, having married in October, by November 78, you came to Hong Kong
Yeah,
and then quickly started integrating into Hong Kong life. Was there a synagogue at that time for you to join? Were you mixing with Jewish people?
You may have heard of Ohel Leah Synagogue. We became members. It was the only game in town. The Jewish, of course this facility wasn't here, there was the Jewish Club, which was a house, like I said, almost a suburban house on the land. There was a lot of vacant land with a tennis court on it. And we went to Ohel Leah Synagogue. And I wasn't used to going to an Orthodox synagogue, although I could follow what was going on. But,
And 1980, 2 years later, 4 years later, 1980, Michael was born here in Hong Kong.
yes.
And your career had really taken off at that stage. You were working for Kudes and inherited a client that was about to change your life professionally.
Yeah, my David Halpern, who some of you may know, is still here. He left Hong Kong for a year, and one of his clients was a Filipino guy named Manny Pangilinan. Manny was a sole Procter & Gamble full scholarship winner to the Wharton School in his year from the Philippines. And he was a real, and still is, a real dynamo, workaholic, and we became friends. And one night we were working late on a project, and I said to him, what are you doing with your life? He said, it seems to me there are a lot of opportunities, at least then, with so-called overseas Chinese business groups who were long on assets and ambitions, but didn't have the international expertise, which was me. I was about 30 years old or something. So we were already doing work with the Salim group of Indonesia. Anthony Salim was almost identical in age to me. And we did talk to a number of groups, but that was our first choice. So to make a long story short, by May of '81, I had left Kuder Brothers, Manny had left American Express Bank, and we were holed up in a tiny office in a central building, but with a commitment to build an international conglomerate in banking and trading and other businesses for the Salim Group, preferably with a public listing and with what proved to be $135 million to be invested with us, for this group.
And you even ended up by negotiating with Horace Kadoorie in order to purchase a company owned by him.
Yes. Well, in those days, U.S. Bank was a target. You had to have a U.S. Bank holding company, even if it was overseas, that was not involved in anything other than banking. So we needed 2 holding companies, and one of them, in those days, you could buy so-called shell companies that were extant, but were inactive. And one of them, the Jardine Fleming Group, pointed us to the Kadoories, who had control of the Shanghai Land Investment Company, which owned nothing, had a few dollars in the bank, had no debt, but which used to own 27 quote-unquote parcels in Shanghai. When we investigated the parcels, they were city blocks with another 28 properties, some such number each. There's a whole story, which I can get to if you want, but they had lost everything, and this is just a shell company with a listing on the then Kowloon Stock Exchange. So we bought it for $1.5 million Hong Kong dollars as a premium, had to do a takeover offer, but had great plans, and so nobody accepted it. That became, I believe, First Pacific Holdings Limited.
1982, your second son Ben is born, and 2 years later, as a family, you go to the Hamptons to spend your summer.
Yes. When Michael was born, Debbie and I took him to the States when he was about a year and a half, and we hop, skipped, and jumped on our home leave and came back to Hong Kong exhausted. And we said to each other, we need a vacation. And Barry Metzger, who was also from Maplewood, as was Gordon Chang. There were 3 of the then 31 American lawyers from Maplewood, New Jersey. Barry said to me, you know, we're doing something different. We're going to rent a house in the Hamptons, which is by the beach, with extra bedrooms, and make everybody come visit us. And the light bulb went up. I said, that's such a great idea. So it was very late in the game. I managed, if you know New Yorkers, they spend all year trying to find the best possible rental. I rented something sight unseen on Hand Lane in Amagansett, but it worked great. And the second year we went back, we went there, and there was, I took Michael to the beach. I came back about 6 o'clock, and the maid met me. I brought the maid over. Mom's not well, so I went up to see Debbie and I said, what's wrong? I have this terrible, terrible headache, the worst headache I've ever had in my life. So that rang a bell. I said, we got to get you to the hospital. No, I don't want to go. I said, no, we have to go. So I put her in the car and drove her to Southampton Hospital. They thought she just had a terrible migraine because she had some history of migraines, although not lately. Driving out of the parking lot, she collapses on the front seat, so I immediately just turned, bring her back in. She's unconscious, and they took her in, and they knew she had a cerebral hemorrhage. She woke up after about 30 minutes, and everything was fine. She had all her functionality, toes, fingers, everything. But they suspected, they asked me to do a spinal tap, which was done, blood in the spinal fluid, and suspected she'd had a bleeding aneurysm, which in fact was here. 2 days later, transferred to Columbia Presbyterian in Hospital in Manhattan. Her attending physician was Dr. Moore, who later treated Mayor Koch for his stroke. Dr. Moore said to me, we've got her on vessel dilators, and she needs to be kept calm. I said, can you operate? He said, we don't operate immediately. You can't go into a brain that's kind of jumping because the bleeding, but we'll set her up next week. And he then said prophetically to me, I have to tell you, there's a 1% chance per day of a rebleed. But Debbie was fine. She was having her, tab, since there was no Diet Coke, and was okay. I think it was the Wednesday morning they had set her up for surgery at 9:30. I arrived, it was sudden because the nurse's strike had just ended. I arrived there, she's not in her room, so they said she's in surgery, so I said, okay, good. Shortly afterward, Dr. Moore comes in and says she's had another bleed, and she's in a coma, which really did it for me, and that's when I lost it. And her, her brain activity, and you can see the chart just went down, and we had to go through this protocol to disconnect her.
Dreadful business. So, tragically, Debbie died after a 6-year marriage. She had 2 young children, just 2 and 3.5. Yeah. And you came back to Hong Kong with the children and had to make a major readjustment as a single parent.
Some people said you should stay in the States, come back. And I said, well, first of all, I had a great job here, and I had help here. I had 2 maids. I said, I got to get a driver, because Debbie used to drive them. So I did. I hired my driver, who had worked for another Jewish family, the Lighters. You remember them? Mm-hmm. And his father, Ivan's father, had worked for the Lighters. This guy already knew Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, everything. I became the caregiver. I had breakfast with him every day, bar none. I had dinner with him every night. If I was invited out to a dinner, I'd say, okay, I'll be a little late. I can't come until maybe 8:40 or something. Never a problem. And I stopped working on Saturdays, which we had then at that time. And,
You managed, and 3 years after Debbie's death, you remarried Vivian. Right. And from Vivian you had a baby daughter, Rochelle.
Yes, I married the infertile Vivian. I'd even seen her doctor. She had endometriosis, and her doctor, Lopez, had said, she's not going to conceive, So 1 month, or it turned out to be a month after we got married, she did conceive, and she had a miracle baby, which is my daughter, who's in the red shirt in the middle there of this picture.
Now, sadly, that marriage failed, and in 1989 you divorced. But you and Vivian have always stayed on excellent terms.
Yeah, we had the world's best divorce in that I was concerned about the shell. I did a smart thing. I bought an apartment 5 minutes walking distance from my house. Her mom and I never had a fight from the time we separated, and Rochelle grew up with both parents. Not only civil, but friendly. We even double dated and stuff like that.
Trying to do me out of a job, don't you?
Your fees!
You love paying them, you know. Now, you were totally involved in what was going on in Hong Kong. You were absolutely in the middle of the crash of 1987, with the crash of the Hong Kong stock market. And you were appointed on the board of the Futures Exchange. So that must have taken up quite a lot of time in terms of dealing with all the financial chaos that was going on in Hong Kong in 1987 and 1988.
Yeah. In October 1987, for those who remember it, it felt like a monster was traveling around the world, biting the heads off all the stock exchanges and then coming back for more. It was absolutely terrifying. Here in Hong Kong, the stock exchange closed for about 4 days, if I remember correctly, and then did reopen with a great crash of stocks, but you know, it functioned. The futures exchange, however, went bust. Why? Because Robert Ng of Sino Land had a whole host of futures contracts parked in $2 companies, and he couldn't or wouldn't deliver. And so the government made up its mind to remedy this and to rescue the fund. First Pacific Group was approached, among others, to put in some money, which we did. And then Bernard Asher, who was the Jewish general counsel, if I remember correctly, and director of HSBC, I knew him from here, and he asked me to join the board, which I did. Up to that point, I had never bought a futures contract. And up to today, I've never bought a futures contract. I actually had no interest whatsoever in the substantive business, but the guy who headed up was Wilford Newton, who was the head of MTR here, did this and then went on to London Transit and Transport and London Underground. And working with him was just magnificent. He was a real heavy, serious, solid driver, and we had to whip all these little Chinese brokerage firms into shape. He and the government had to threaten Robert Ng, and who finally coughed up some dough, not much. And ultimately, I did resign because when the June 4th incident happened, I basically could not get out of my bed in the morning. I had so much going on, and I had to get rid of some stuff, including resigning from YPO, which Robbie introduced me to, and gratefully took me back later. And I told Wilford, I've got kids at home, I can't do everything. But we'd done our hard work at that point, and so that was...
And business developed well. David S. Davis had joined the group, so the First Pacific Group was getting larger and larger. And then in 1989, you created FP Special Assets. So professionally, everything was going very strong. At the same time, you remained involved in the development, religious and spiritually, with what was going on here in Hong Kong, and joined Bob Green and Chuck Monnett in the creation and development of the UJC here in Hong Kong.
Correct. The story is pretty well known, but Bob's Green's eldest son, David, right, was about to be, had studied at Oholia, but was told that because Grace had converted through a Reform rabbi, they would not recognize him as being Jewish and wouldn't do the Bar Mitzvah. So that hurt a lot of feelings. I have to say, I'm not anti-Oholia. Then, it was not as friendly as it is now. It really was a different kettle of fish. There were a lot of kind of old-timers and innies and outies. But anyway, we got Rabbi, what's his name, John Levi up from Australia, and we had the Bar Mitzvah, but we felt, you know, Chuck Monnett, Bob Green, and I felt it was time for an alternative. So for a short time, we had, we got a Reform prayer book, and I led the services in the library of the Jewish Club, but that didn't go over so well with the Orthodox community, so we were asked to leave, and we continued both in other people's homes, but ultimately in Exchange Square in the American Club, once a month we started, as many of these congregations do, which then became twice a month, and then ultimately 4 times a month. So until we got Sam Joseph as, I think, our first visiting rabbi, I and others led services, but we've just grown and grown to now about 175, 180 member units, families, 550 people, including kids.
And your role in those days was invaluable, as you say. You were leading services, you were fluent in Hebrew, fluent in English, were able to explain what was going on to a whole new generation of reform.
You're very kind. Remind me to hire you for my next divorce.
Good boy. In 1993, you made Aliyah to Israel.
To Hong Kong, just to truly. Yes, I renounced my U.S. citizenship in 1993. I'm not supposed to say publicly why, but let's just say I'm a Zionist. I'm not in any kind of trouble. And I landed in Israel and made Aliyah and got a Teudat Zehut, and I hired a law firm to make the case in the Ministry of the Interior that I was a Jewish businessman with business out here, and they should waive the usual one-year residency requirement so they could issue a passport to me, which they did. And so I've been an Israeli citizen for 20 years now. It was literally this month in May, but 1993. You weren't born yet, so you told me.
Quite right. You've had a health scare in 1993 and again in 2007. Those health scares were dealt with here in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I married a third time, which marriage I now officially deny, since they were making bets at the wedding that it wouldn't last 6 months, and indeed it didn't. And I think the stress from that unhappy situation, by May of that was 92 when I remarried, and 93, I was short of breath. I was out jogging on Bowen Road thinking, well, I'm really out of shape, but it was more than that. My secretary, the one I had before, bless her soul, had signed me up for First Pacific's annual physical exam without knowing anything. So I went, and Dr. Patrick Coe, when I did the stress test, stopped it at 6 minutes and said, I don't like what I'm seeing. So the next morning they did through here, they do a triple balloon angioplasty and stent insertion in my poor suffering coronary arteries. And turns out I had the same thing happen about 14 years later.
Too much chopped liver.
No, I was then engaged. It's fatal for me to get engaged or married. So that's the problem. It's true.
You've done a huge amount for Hong Kong Jewish charities. I do know.
Actually, she's never going to be mean to me because she's on permanent retainer. So we have a confidentiality arrangement, and she knows I've promised her that she will handle all my divorces.
And not so confidential, but he doesn't introduce me at dinner parties by saying, "This is Sharon Sir, she does all my divorces." It's a real conversation killer. Huge amount for Hong Kong Jewish charities. You were very involved with the fundraising for the Joint Distribution Committee in Shanghai. That was a UJC initiative.
Let me just, if I can mention that briefly. You all know about that Shanghai was an open city, and it was a destination for Jews fleeing the Nazis in World War II, and some 25 to 30,000 Jews were there, chiefly in the Hongqiu district in the so-called Shanghai Jewish ghetto. After the war ended, most of them went to other places, some here, but most to the U.S., Israel, and Australia. One guy whose family had been there, and these included Michael Blumenthal, who became the U.S. Treasury Secretary later, but not him, but another fellow in New York, went to the Joint Distribution Committee and said, I want to say thank you. So what can we do? So the JDC consulted with the Israelis and came up with two projects. One, an old age home, but to give the more modern Israeli methods of engaging the old people, not just warehousing them. And the second for mentally disadvantaged kids. And they had Israeli computers. And if you know the JDC, they set these things up and then tell you to take them, to replicate them, go forward with them. So a guy named, a gal and a guy named Alberto Sendere, who we still see from time to time, came to town and said, we need some more money, can you help us? So the UJC got together and we put up about $25,000 US and helped them out. And then subsequently we went up there and saw the sites, and it was quite remarkable what was done, and it was very much respected. As you know, Jews are, Chinese people in my experience are philo-Semitic. They all think we're brilliant bankers and financiers and business people and family-oriented. We obviously like Chinese food and scientists and thinkers. And the experience of the Jewish community up there was really wonderful.
We're running a little bit out of time,
sorry.
but I do want people to know just how involved you've been, a real integral part in terms of the development of the Hong Kong Jewish Film Festival, Jewish Times Asia, and many, many Jewish and Israeli endeavors in Hong Kong. You're a board member of the Hong Kong Israeli Chamber of Commerce. And there are a few events in Hong Kong where you're not either participating in terms of a financial donor or, even more important, as a real mentor to those charities. You then started a new business of your own, Farmerling, which also many members of the Jewish community have become shareholders, believing very much in you, and that's proved to be very, very much of a success. In 2009, your son Michael married. Sadly, a week after the wedding, your mother passed away, and you were brought straight back to the London roots by having to deal with some of the winding up process of all of that. But one of the very best things that's come out of the children's lives recently is the birth of Waverly Deborah here, who is your first grandchild.
Yes, this was taken about 2 weeks ago. She's 10 and a half months old, and she's preparing for her Carnegie Hall debut, as you hadn't noticed. I wanted to say something about the Jewish Film Festival and Jewish Times Asia, because I founded neither of them. My role was really in helping out. Howard funded this out of his own pocket, as he well knows, and told me in, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago that he wasn't going to continue because he couldn't afford to pay for it out of his own pocket. And I said, let's get a society together, a charitable society with an inland revenue charitable deduction and support, which is what happened. I mean, that was my role was as a restaurant. Same with Philip J. He started Jewish Times Asia with really out of his own pocket. He never capitalized it. In the 2007 downturn, as advertising revenues got thin, he was facing the wall. So Robert Lewis and I came in and recapitalized him under a limited liability company, and he's now profitable in the black every month. And,
it's obvious that Hong Kong has been an essential part of your past. Do you see Hong Kong and Hong Kong Jewish life being any part of your future?
Yes, but I didn't get to tell the third part of my story.
We might have to come back for another chat.
Let me just tell you, when I had to wind up my mother's estate, my mother was English. Her grandfather, named Jacob Lewis, bought an industrial property in Whitechapel Road in the East End in 1923. Jacob died, left it to one of his sons, my granddad Joseph. He died, left it to his wife. She died, left it to my mom and her 2 sisters. So as part of her estate, she had an undivided 1/3 stake in this building, which one of the other sisters basically collected rent from. End of story. So I said to my cousins over there, we've got to sell this because I got to get it out of the estate in the United States so I can wind it up. So initially they told me it was held in fee simple, and on that basis it was valued. And then they came back later and said, well, actually it's leased. I said, leased? Leased from whom? There's a lease that was signed in the year 1595 for a massive 8 pence per year. Not from the Crown, mind you, which they can find, but from some Joe blog somewhere. And no one has paid the leasehold payment of 8 pence per year for God knows how many hundreds of years. So I had UK lawyers working for me. I said, well, can we get an application for adverse possession? And they said, no, it's not adversely possessed. It's still under lease until the year 2095. Then, by operation of UK law, there's an additional automatic 15 years, and only then does the 25-year adverse possession period begin. So yes, by the year 2135, you can file for adverse possession. So thank you very much, English law. Anyway, my cousin, his super fund, after he twisted it bank trustee's arms off, agreed to buy it at yet a further discount. I just wanted to get rid of it. I didn't care, but it was really a fascinating and unwelcome little bit of ancient English property law that I had to deal with in the winding up of the estate.
And the children now all grown up. Rochelle's now engaged, and Ben is in the US, and Michael is happily married with a baby. Is there a future for you here in Hong Kong?
My only home is Hong Kong. When I leave Hong Kong, I know this is going to bring tears to some of you, but I'm actually homeless. I rotate around the world. I typically spend January through April in Palm Beach. I'm here May and June. I'm in the woods of Maine for July, and in Israel these days August into September, and back here September through December. My kids, as you can appreciate, who have older kids, have conveniently arrayed themselves in the United States. One, the eldest, is in San Francisco, Michael. Number 2, Ben, is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and number 3, Rochelle, is in New York. So they're close together. And I told them I'm not moving to St. Louis, Missouri to be equidistant from all of you. So anyway, we do our best.
Maybe they'll come to you, because we have a poster here of a synagogue you've created in Maine.
Yes, the woods of Maine. I've been going with a friend of mine, and she had said, why don't you start up Jewish services? So I said, we know there were some Jews hidden. They're like hidden in the woods in the summer. There's a reason why they're hidden in the woods. The reason, I'll tell you, the reason why, because they're hidden in the woods in these very fancy kind of rustic estates, log cabins. Back in the bad old days in the United States, up to the only about 50 years ago, there were many of the resort hotels were restricted. If you wanted to go to the Balsams, which is not too far away, no Jews allowed. So the Gimbels family and all these wealthy Jews said, oh, screw the heck with that, we'll just buy our own estate. So they did. And of course that became illegal in the United States, but there turned out to be a lot of Jews. So I said, all right, but we knew a couple people to call, but I didn't know really who was here in the summer. In the winter, there were only 2,000 people in this little spot. So I published in the newspaper exactly the ad that you'll see at the far right there. And the lake that Oquassic is on is called Lake Moosluk Maguntuk, which is Abenaki Indian for something like moose, I forget, wading in water or something else. So I styled the name of the nascent synagogue as Beit Moosluk Maguntuk, published it in Hebrew and English, saying, on the theory that if you build it, they will come. Sure enough, they did. The first Friday night, we had 10 people, and then it grew. We got up to about, it varies with the attendance up in the Rangeley Lakes region of Maine, but we typically will get up to 25, 28 people. It's held in a non-denominational log cabin church, which was built in 1917. It's a one-room log cabin. And I called them and said, would it be okay? They said, we would love it. No one's using this here. And it turns out there's a cross on the pulpit, which they always, it's got a hook on it. They always take it off when we show up on Friday evening. And I drape a big Israeli flag, so it's very Jewish. And then when we're done, I pull it back up and we hang the cross back. And I asked the members each year to contribute. And the small community ends up giving them pretty decent contributions, $1,000, $1,200, sometimes $1,500. I have restrained myself for 6 years, it'll be 6 years this summer, from saying to the president of the church there that if he really needed more money, he really needed to have more Jewish members. I never have.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much of your life.
Thank you.
It's been a delight. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Robert Meyer.
Well, you turned off my sound. One thing I have to say, it's both an honor and a curse to be asked to be interviewed for a fireside chat. The honor is, the blessing, you've got enough in your life history to be of interest to other people. The curse is that you're gray-haired and you're officially an alta cock.
One of the best. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.